Andrew Feinstein is a former South African MP who was a member of the ANC. His most notable work has been investigating the global arms trade. He is currently a member of the UK Labour Party, to which he is a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Andrew, it is an honour, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's great to be with you.
Yes, I'm so glad you're on here. There's so many things we need to talk about. We could probably go for hours. But I'll start off with this, is that broadly speaking, what state do you believe that the left is in at the moment? Are we in a weak one, a commanding one? Do you think we have any influence over the government? Obviously, we've just lost a big election a few years ago. What's the state of the left?
It's a difficult question to answer because one has to decide in the first instance the extent to which one equates the Labour Party under Keir Starmer with the left in this country. Keir Starmer is my constituency MP, so I'm experiencing his leadership in a very full-on way. I've experienced him as an MP since he first ran for office here, and it's been a joyless experience. However, outside of the Labour Party, which I think is currently actually in a delinquent state, I think that the left in Britain is in a very interesting place, because I think that what has happened to the rightward shift of the Labour Party is that more and more people have got involved in what Jeremy Corbyn tried to bring to the party, what I describe as movement politics. But they're doing that outside of the Labour Party because the Labour Party no longer provides the space or the motivation to do that. So I think we are seeing a whole lot of struggles that are being fought in some sectors that they've always been fought in, the trade union movement. And I think there's some very interesting things happening in the British trade union movement. I think if one looks at specific types of activism, be it around climate issues, be it around issues of war and peace and nuclear weapons, be it around gender and sexual orientation issues, I think we're seeing some remarkable struggles that are being taken on by growing movements. And I think that's very encouraging. I mean, it does make me think that the left outside of Parliament is actually in quite a good place. Does that have any impact on Parliament? Does it have any impact on what is a largely reactionary Labour Party? I mean, it certainly doesn't have huge impact on government. And we can see that in opinion polls and things like that. We have this situation where we have probably the most inept and incompetent, as well as corrupt government this country has seen for decades. And we have an opposition leader who seems almost like a cheerleader for this appalling and awful government. This seems to be the approach to opposition, which I find extraordinary. And the sort of movement politics outside of the Westminster bubble don't seem to be having an impact on the government in any meaningful way, short of pushing it in some directions that the mainstream media would describe as populist. So the government hasn't been quite as appalling economically as I thought it would be. There are a few things that the government is doing that even the Labour Party won't do, be it around consideration of increases in corporate taxation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that is all a superficial mask behind which it is carrying on an abject, deeply, deeply corrupt government that, as we've seen during lockdown and during the COVID-19 crisis, has been handing out billion-pound contracts to its mates and donors. And the left hasn't been able to yet impact on that.
So you brought up a lot of points there. And the last thing you said about the government contracts, and actually some ministers were breaking the law. But we had Keir Starmer, who refused to call any resignations because he believed the public didn't want that. Which is, I find, very strange in contrast to members of his own party. He's happy to fire or suspend members of his own party quite quickly, but won't ever call any resignations of the government. That's quite worrying, do you not think?
That's a superb point, and I think it's extremely worrying. I mean, under Keir Starmer's leadership, more Jewish members of the Labour Party have been suspended, supposedly for anti-Semitism, than any other members of the Labour Party, which is an absurdity. And those suspended members who I know are all absolutely anti-racist. And their hatred of anti-Semitism is as strong as their hatred of Islamophobia, anti-black racism, any other form of racism. Keir Starmer has introduced to the Labour Party a hierarchy of racism, where the only thing that is of concern is anti-Semitism that upsets conservative Jews in Britain. Because anti-Semitism directed at left-wing Jews, which is how I identify, is completely ignored. The fact that the Labour Party has become an incredibly unwelcoming place for people like me, who have a lifelong history of anti-racism and of seeing anti-Semitism as important as all other forms of racism, seem to be unwanted in the Labour Party. And I think that's tragic. I think taken together with Keir Starmer's attitude to the government and to opposition generally, and to his inability to give voice, let alone substance, to any really progressive policies, is incredibly worrying for the Labour Party. I mean, to be quite honest with you, I think that the government is getting a free ride. I think Keir Starmer is perhaps the most inept leader the Labour Party has ever had. I think he is an incredibly divisive figure, which he's been in his constituency since he first arrived here. He seems to be a person without any sort of intrinsic values, ethics, principles, or political positions. He seems to simply blow in whichever wind he thinks is appropriate. And that seems to be, at the moment, largely reactionary positions on all of the key issues facing the United Kingdom and the world at the moment. And I think it's a huge opportunity lost, because I think it would not be difficult to challenge this government and to compete with this government electorally, as Jeremy Corbyn did. But I think even more concerning is the sense that he almost seems to be a stooge of the establishment, making life easy for the establishment, which includes the British state in its broad conception, and the way in which we effectively in this country have the best democracy money can buy. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn was a very real threat to that establishment, both at home, because of the levels of elite corruption, but also, crucially, internationally, where Corbyn takes very different positions to the British establishment. And there are positions that undermine a worldview that is focused by militarism, by the awful, awful role that the British arms trade plays globally, and expanding that role, selling weapons to literally whoever on the planet wants them, regardless of how awful the regimes we're selling to might be. The challenges, the sort of establishment orthodoxies, where it seems unacceptable now to, for instance, criticize Israel for its illegal and brutal occupation of Palestine, where it seems beyond the pale to criticize Saudi Arabia and the UAE for their murderous conflict in Yemen, where using British arms, they have violated international law. They are, in my opinion, committing war crimes, and we are deeply complicit in that. So Jeremy Corbyn was a threat to all of that. And Keir Starmer, who claimed to be progressive in his campaign for the leadership, has in fact, as leader, come across as a puppet for the reactionary establishment in this country. And I think it's tragic.
In terms of Saudi Arabia and obviously the global arms trade, for me, Jeremy Corbyn was, of course, he was a threat to the establishment. And many people would say, oh, it's because he wants to raise taxes on corporations. And that's one thing. But I do personally believe that that was why he was attacked so much. The establishment fit him so much was more because of the military industrial complex and relations to corrupt governments across the world, because we have deals with them, like I said, about Saudi Arabia. So I think that was why many people felt he was more of a threat rather than just simply the domestic issue. That is one thing. Because I think that this period of neoliberalism, we might be seeing an end to it. And I don't know if the Labour Party will, but if they do adopt a left-wing domestic issue, I think that is where it stops. I think when it comes to international issues, it will be very much the status quo.
The Labour Party, with the exception probably of the leadership of Michael Foot briefly, but generally hasn't been great on international issues in the way that Jeremy Corbyn and those people around him are. And there are still some Labour MPs who are extremely good on these issues. Zara Sultana comes to mind, Richard Burgon. There are a few on the left of the party who remain good on these issues. But the only thing where I would think I would have a slightly different nuance on it is that I think because of the overarching impact of this period of neoliberal capitalism that we're living through, the international and the domestic are intertwined and linked in some very important ways. And I think the most important way is that the sort of very damaging, I would argue sometimes racist foreign policy, a sort of a neo-imperialist foreign policy that is followed by the United Kingdom in many parts of the world. And it's not just corrupt regimes that we're in bed with. It is often human rights abusing, deeply autocratic regimes. That international militarism and adventurism feeds what is known as the global national security elite. And how that national security elite manifests domestically is in senior politicians and their political parties, because the defense companies are very important in funding political parties around the world. Openly in the US, in what I describe as a form of legalized bribery, more covertly in the United Kingdom and Europe. And so I think the sort of domestic issues of levels of corporate tax that are paid by corporations within a country, the sort of state welfare that is paid out to corporations at the expense of benefits to ordinary citizens, investments in healthcare, education, et cetera, and of course, addressing the massive climate challenge that we all face. So I think in those ways, the two are quite closely intertwined. And the fact that this sort of obeisance to corporatism, both abroad and at home, so underpins all of our politics that the state, the British state, almost just feels like an appendage of corporations, and not even British corporations, but global corporations, many of which aren't headquartered in the United Kingdom, but are treated here like you would expect British citizens to be treated. They are given lavish welfare. It feels to me, they operate above the law. Today, tragically, is yet another anniversary of what happened at Grenfell. And let's remember that a French and American corporation were absolutely instrumental in the tragedy of Grenfell, in cahoots with the council of one of the richest boroughs in one of the world's largest cities, in one of the world's richest countries. And have those companies been called to account? Absolutely not. So I think that internationalist worldview, I think that the two, and I think this is you talk about the sort of, we hope, the end game of neoliberal capitalism as we've understood it since the late 70s, early 80s. But I think what replaces it, and this is what we're not sure about, we're in one of those classic interregnums between sort of a paradigm that we know isn't working anymore for the majority of people, but not quite knowing what replaces it. And I think one of the things that has to replace it is a different view of the world politically and economically that would impact the world both within Britain, but also Britain's view and attitude to and engagement with the world.
Well, I suppose that when we look at the elections in Peru, and for me, that's almost a perfect example of where we are politically, globally, which is that you've got a socialist left-wing candidate on one side, and on the other side, a candidate who was the daughter of a human rights abuser, dictator who was serving 25 years. So you've kind of got the radical left and the far right because the centre ground is collapsed. But that's the thing, is neoliberalism is ending. But the problem is what comes after that. Because it doesn't just mean that simply we can make the left-wing case, which we obviously should make the left-wing case, but at the same time, the far right emerges. And that's very worrying. So with all these issues together, and it looks like to me that I've always thought that centrists and moderates always side with the centre-right, even if they call themselves liberals. They're not really liberal when it comes to tackling racism in the far right. What do? We've got to tackle an economic system which is collapsing in front of our eyes, but at the same time, a re-emergence of the far right.
The reality is we've seen throughout history that when people go through economic disaster, the far right has always been adept at stepping in and offering those people scapegoats. What terrifies me, I don't even know what the words center right and left mean anymore, because the reality is that the government of Donald Trump, the government of Boris Johnson, are what I understand as the far right. So I think what we're calling the far right is what we perhaps years ago understood as the extreme right. And I think that the links between the far and the extreme right is very close, as we saw during Trump, as we're seeing during Boris Johnson's premiership here, and as we're seeing in countries of Central and Eastern Europe. We shouldn't forget that. I mean, Boris Johnson welcomed Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, to 10 Downing Street just the other day, and Keir Starmer refused to criticize Viktor Orban. Now, Viktor Orban is a man who has based his entire political career on anti-Semitism. But Keir Starmer, who claims to be such a champion of fighting anti-Semitism, along with all the others, the Margaret Hodges and the Lucien Bergers, and the Luke Akehursts, and all of these people who claim to be so upset about anti-Semitism, refuse to speak out when one of the world's most prominent anti-Semites is being welcomed with open arms at 10 Downing Street. Orban, like many on the far right, is also deeply, deeply corrupt. What happens in Hungary is what those of us who work on corruption issues in a sort of a politically conscientized way describe as state capture, where the highest institutions of the state are captured for private interests. And you could argue that that is happening in this country too. It happened in South Africa under Jacob Zuma. It has happened in Hungary under Viktor Orban. And I think if Donald Trump had won a second term, we could say that it was certainly embedding in the United States of America. So I think what we can do is, for me, the positive of this is that the left gives me an enormous amount of hope, because I think we are seeing on social media, We are seeing in the development of some campaigns within countries, across countries, globally, we're seeing the emergence of a strong left. I think where the left lags behind is in electoral politics. And the reason for that is our electoral political systems are broken, just as our economics are broken. Our representative liberal democracy is no longer working.
You made a fantastic point about how the left never seems to be successful electorally. And it's a great point because of the system, which is why you can have right-wing candidates or right-wing parties. They can easily capture the state because the system allows them to do it. In a way that the left, it's very hard for the left to capture the state. And it seems that we will always be in the passenger seat. We will be, pressuring governments and politicians and parties to get the correct position. But it's very hard to see in the near future to see the left ever capturing the state. When that was very close, Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 was 2,500 votes from becoming prime minister. It wasn't just a challenge of him winning. It was also the challenge of the state apparatus, the forces globally, and the forces inside his own party. Because I believe that if he was prime minister, I don't believe half the things would have got passed. Not for lack of trying, but because of all these forces together. So it does beg the question, and I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but are the left always the passenger seat? Trying to tell the driver where to go without actually being at the steering wheel?
So I think the first thing is that I think where the Corbyn project was less successful was, and I feel absurd saying this for obvious reasons, Jeremy is almost too nice a person, in the sense that what differentiates Jeremy Corbyn from so many others is that he's just a normal human being. It's not all about Jeremy Corbyn. It's about other people. And he shows, and I experienced this extraordinarily, having the privilege of working with Nelson Mandela during the transition in South Africa and in the first years of our democracy. Somebody who is very popular, but remains very humble, is incredibly respectful of other people, and is clear that the role of public service, be it elected or employed, is the serving of the people of the country. But that meant, for instance, that Jeremy was almost too nice to introduce automatic reselection across the board in the Labour Party, which would have changed the face of the Labour Party. Because unfortunately, the Parliamentary Labour Party is still full of people who were dropped into safe Labour seats, although I'm not sure there is much of a safe Labour seat anymore under Keir Starmer, had no connection to that area, had very little interest in their actual constituents. They did their surgeries and this, that, and the other, but no real passionate interest in the well-being of their constituents. And if you had mandatory reselection, you wouldn't have that situation. If we had fewer professional politicians and more ordinary people representing other people from their community, we would have a very different looking parliament in this country and a very different looking Labour Party. So I think there were certain things like that. I would argue that addressing the anti-Semitism crisis was another one of them. And that's part of the reason why, because, that was a big part of Jeremy's success and popularity, is that he is just such an ordinary person and he can't bring himself to do some very tough things. And unfortunately, probably some of them needed to be done. So that's the difficulty that the left starts with. But I don't think we should ever lose hope about the left winning power. This is, again, this parallel of fighting the daily battles while looking to the longer term future. Because I do think there are forms of political organization and representation that we could come to see in the future, where we find that progressive ideas actually come to dominate.
There's a by-election coming up very soon, Batley and Spen. It's a high population of Muslim community. Many in the political commentariat has said that Labour voters or voters do not care about international issues. But word on the street is that the Israel-Palestine conflict is a large issue. It's especially a large issue when it comes to the Muslim community. And there's also fears that George Galloway might make headroom. So what's your analysis of the upcoming by-election? What do you think the state of the Labour Party is coming into the election? And if they do lose, does that make Keir Starmer's position vulnerable?
The Labour Party repeated all the mistakes that they made in the recent local election and by-election that took place at around the same time. You had popular candidates not being allowed to stand. You had a candidate who has a connection to the area at least, but who only joined the party a month before she was made the candidate. And I can understand some of the thinking, because obviously the tragedy of her sister, who was the MP who was murdered. I think the polls are suggesting that amongst Muslim voters, issues in the Middle East are unsurprisingly big issues. And if you look at a recent poll that was released on attitudes of Muslims within the Labour Party, you're seeing huge numbers of Muslim members of the Labour Party feeling completely disaffected and feeling that the party under Keir Starmer has no interest in them, doesn't represent them. And the Labour Party under Keir Starmer chose to simply ignore all of those complaints about Islamophobic behavior in the party. And none of that is surprising. If you look at the dismissive way in which Starmer has occasionally, under huge pressure, eked out some little squeaky comment about the appalling murderous behavior of Israel in Gaza recently, where almost 300 innocent people, many of them women and children, were slaughtered in indefensible and unforgivable ways. And the leader of the Labour Party, a democratic socialist party, was silent for days and days, if not weeks. And then when his statements do come, they're so pathetic and anodyne, like that absolutely awful photo of him and Angela Rayner taking the knee in his first acknowledgement of the Black Lives Movement months after the issue was at its apex. So, I mean, I think the two things that have really surprised me about Keir Starmer's leadership is, on the one hand, I expected the people around him to be more just very basically politically competent. I mean, I'm not the greatest political strategist the world has seen. But really, the sorts of basic mistakes they make, and I wish I could say they make on a weekly or a daily basis, that they make on an hourly basis, the sheer political incompetence of whoever is running this party is just baffling. And then leave out the politics, just the day-to-day efficiency and competence, which again is so appalling. I mean, it makes Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party look highly efficient and competent by comparison, which is not something I expected to be saying of a Keir Starmer Labour Party. So what does this by-election hold? I mean, there are going to be one of two results, I would imagine. Labour will either squeak a win or they will lose. I think in either situation, Keir Starmer's position is untenable. If they lose, he should go immediately that the result is announced.
I completely agree with the fact is that competency, that's something I'm so surprised about, is, you know, look, what we do know is before Keir Starmer became leader, it was that, look, I'll be the Corbynite candidate without Jeremy Corbyn. I'll keep the popular progressive policies and I will take it to government. I will unite the party. And me personally, I never fell for that. looking into Keir Starmer, like you said, early politically, he's always been quite divisive, but many people did fall for that. Many people voted for Jeremy Corbyn twice as leader, then voted for Keir Starmer. And I am shock and awe that just basic competency is not there. He is when it comes to political operations or any political instincts, he's an abject failure, which is surprising because he has the party machine behind him. He also has many people from the Blair years backing him. Peter Mandelson, who went to the last by-election, Hartlepool. So that's also quite surprising
let's
too.
Let's remind ourselves, Peter Mandelson was the MP for Hartlepool for many, many years, and he had been jettisoned into the constituency. That was his safe Labour seat. And of course, he became a huge Hartlepool fan as a consequence. Peter Mandelson is also the person who early in the Blair years said, not only don't we have any objections to people becoming filthy rich, we like it when people become filthy rich. And unfortunately, with the Blairites, people like Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, and the whole rotten lot of them were actually talking about themselves. They all wanted to become personally filthy rich, and they were very happy about the fact that jettisoning left-wing policies of the Labour Party allowed them to do that. That is why Margaret Thatcher described Tony Blair as her greatest political achievement, because what Tony Blair did is he turned the Labour Party into just another neoliberal party that would not threaten the establishment. So, the fact that the skills and strategies of Peter Mandelson, of Alistair Campbell, and of Tony Blair himself, who when he makes these ghost-like appearances in the media that are so lapped up by The Guardian and everywhere else, who on earth cares for the opinions of a person who has made tens of millions of pounds on the basis of his decision to support the American invasion of Iraq, which has cost over 1 million human lives, on the basis of his very close links to what was at the time the most corrupt company on the planet, BAE Systems, and the way in which he and Sir Richard Evans, the chairperson of BAE Systems, traveled the world corrupting other countries, including the nascent democracy of South Africa, in order to sell more British weapons, even when those countries didn't need and barely use those weapons. Who on earth would want to hear the opinions of those people? Who on earth in 2021 would want to enlist any of those people to try and resuscitate a failing political campaign or a failing political party? It just shows how completely divorced from reality the neoliberal members and leaders of the Labour Party are. Those politics are over. Even Boris Johnson has moved beyond the sort of neoliberal politics of New Labour while keeping in place the crony capitalism that flourished under Margaret Thatcher and under Tony Blair. So, it's part of that political incompetence that they would even think to recruit those people to save a failing party and campaign. And we all saw the results.
But that's the thing, though, is that when I see Keir Starmer trying to revive Blairism, like I said, it's not the 1990s anymore. Slick politicians don't work. You've got Bernie Sanders, who's not the slickest guy, getting almost winning the nomination in 2016 and becoming a prominent figure in US politics. And Jeremy Corbyn, you probably can't wear a decent suit or Durpas tie properly, but he will also never become prime minister. So the 1990s is over. But what's fascinating is that it is clear callback to Blairism, but even they can't mimic it properly, because in my view, as much as the bad politics of the Blair years, at least they had some sort of professional operation that they did win elections and they did sort out the party in their own way. Yes, Keir Starmer has the bad politics, but he can't mimic the effective political operations of Tony Blair in the Blair years. And that's so surprising to me.
Well, I think there are two reasons for that. I think the one is that, as you say, those politics are over. But at least what you saw in those politics, their media messaging was outrageously good. I mean, that was the real skill of New Labour, is that they had Alistair Campbell, who would intimidate editors, intimidate journalists, as so wonderfully captured in the thick of it. You had Tony Blair, who, you know, like Ronald Reagan, wasn't the smartest card in the pack, wasn't the sharpest tool in the toolbox, but boy, could he act just like Ronald Reagan. And, you know, in the Shadow World film, which is a documentary based on one of my books about the global arms trade, Claire Short, who served in the Blair cabinet for a while and then left, there was a big falling out over Iraq and post-invasion, et cetera, et cetera. But even Claire Short says, you know, Tony Blair wanted to act the part of the war hero. And that's what he did. Did he consider the cost of human lives? Did he consider the dangers to British citizens by participating in that invasion? And she says, well, all he cared about was the drama, the acting, the playing of the statesman. And he manages to do that because of the complete laziness and ineptitude of our media, who still today, you know, every time the guy burps, you feel as though he's on the front page or on television. And really, the only people who actually care about Tony Blair in the world are those his lives he has indirectly damaged hugely, who would like to see him in the dock at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But you would think that this man was some sort of a hero. So, you know, that time is gone. The media is in a different place. So even those media tactics don't work anymore. Alistair Campbell's not going to intimidate any journalist today because Alistair Campbell has no power today. So that doesn't work, unfortunately. And then the second part of it is the actual substance of those politics are long gone. And the biggest problem of the Labour Party is reflected in that. Keir Starmer has no politics. And, you know, if you go back to his time as the Director of Public Prosecutions, some of the appalling decisions he took there, you go back to his role as Brexit Secretary, and then his reversal of all of those positions as soon as he was party leader. And most importantly, you go into how quickly and with barely a thought, it would appear, he violated every single one of the 10 or 12 pledges that he made in order to get elected leader of the Labour Party. So basically, the bottom line of Keir Starmer is that when it comes to politics, he lies. But we think he lies. We don't know what he really thinks as a human being. But certainly what he claimed to the Labour Party members he was going to stand for and what he's actually done have been diametric opposites. So why should anybody trust him?
But aside from that, if we focus more on the Conservatives have not dipped below 40%. In my view, they've captured the culture war and bind it with the Brexit vote. And they, no matter what happens, they won't go below 40%. And the Conservatives are smart. They know how to do politics. They know that even after Jeremy Corbyn, that austerity is largely over. Now, their version of an end to austerity is not the end to austerity we would like, but they know how to play politics. So Boris Johnson is happy to invest. He's happy to spend. And actually, you're in a position where it looks like the Labour Party are economically to the right of the Conservatives, which is a complete embarrassment. I have no words to say to that, you know. And now Keir Starmer saying, I back the global G7 tax hike. Well, nobody trusts you anymore because just a few months ago, you were the one saying don't raise corporation tax while Rishi Sunak was proposing it. Now, I believe that the Conservatives are using more of a popular economic interventionism
Absolutely.
with culture wars. And Keir Starmer, I feel like he wants to follow the path of the right down to culture wars. He's too scared to stand up against racism and really fight the culture war. I think he wants to let that side, but then why not offer at least an economic alternative?
Okay, so there are two things. Let me say what I was going to use as the second thing first. Keir Starmer is exacerbating the problems of racism in this country right now. And that's quite a statement to make. For someone who participated in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, for someone who served under Nelson Mandela, for someone who introduced the first ever motion on the Holocaust ever in the history of the South African parliament. That's a big statement to make. And why do I make it? Because Keir Starmer, along with others, has weaponized anti-Semitism, has weaponized the suffering of Jews throughout history, including 39 members of my mother's family who died in the death camps, to get rid of a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. And they've continued to do this to try and get rid of not just the leader, but the entire left-wing membership of the party, with no clue as to who they're going to replace them with as voters, for all of the reasons that we've spoken about. And what that does is it actually means that real anti-Semitism, which is on the rise, that real Islamophobia, which is on the rise, that real anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, all of which are on the rise because of this big rightward shift we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. Those aren't taken as seriously as they should be, because we are so obsessed with false accusations of anti-Semitism against people who are critical of Israel, or people who are critical of the highly reactionary Jewish Board of Deputies that claims, but doesn't actually, but claims to represent the majority of British Jews. So I'm afraid that Keir Starmer has made that bed and he's now lying in it. And the consequences for many, many people will continue long after Keir Starmer is a very tragic little footnote in the history of the Labour Party. But when it comes to the Conservatives, I think you're exactly right. I think that they're using what we describe as populist policies. And I think that to see populist as pejorative is perhaps a little misleading, because we then feed into this notion that there is just a tiny elite who really get politics. And they do politics the proper way, the sort of view of the centrists. And to actually respond to popular feelings of people, of the people you're supposed to represent, is a terrible thing. To actually do things that might be popular amongst a lot of people is somehow wrong. Where we really need to engage as progressives, rather in the culture wars, because we know what we stand for. We know what real anti-racism is. We know what it is to not discriminate against any person on the basis of any of their characteristics, because that's the political tradition that we've spent our lives in. We've got to move from the culture wars to what we maybe need to call the information wars. And that's why Julian Assange is facing the treatment that he is facing. Because I'm not sure if people are aware, but he actually is not guilty of any crime anymore. But he is still being held in prison pending an extradition request by the United States of America, despite the fact that his mental health has deteriorated so badly, and despite the fact that he could be executed if he was extradited to the United States of America. And what did Julian Assange do? And I don't need for people to like Julian Assange. I've never met the man. So I have no idea what he's like as a person or a personality. But I'll tell you what he did do. He took information that our governments, the most powerful governments in the world, didn't want in the public domain about the way that they really behaved. And he put that information in the public domain where every citizen could read it themselves. It didn't have to come through the 74% distorting media. They could simply go online and actually read what Hillary Clinton said, actually read what our various prime ministers said and our various ministers.
Well, in terms of Julian Assange, and it doesn't even matter what people think personally of him, It's quite clear, though, that the way he's been treated is clearly a message to say to people, do not speak out against the corrupt or speak truth to power. That is a warning message. And that does get onto the question of the wider media, because there's so many causes that we have to fight. And to me, climate change is obviously the biggest issue that humanity faces. But you can't do anything about these issues when we have a media which is probably one of the worst in the West. I mean, even compared to the US, they have some bad media, but they look at our press and think they're astonished. We have journalists who, if I were to say Laura Kuenssberg, isn't really a journalist at all, and she's getting a fat wage to essentially be another spokesperson for the government. We have media pundits who are so out of touch, and they're not even open to new ideas. When we talk about left-wing ideas on mainstream media platform, there's no inquisitiveness about where they come from. In 2017, Jeremy Corbyn won 40% of the vote, and the media still held him in complete and utter disdain, despite the fact that 40% of the British public voted for a left-wing platform, and it's still not taken seriously. And obviously this is what we're trying to do. And obviously you've got your film about the arms trade. I'm trying to obviously start my channel and create a left growing community. We've got the Canary, Squawk Box, Navarro, all these different outlets. But the mainstream media won't go away for a very, very long time. And it's a struggle, and I do sometimes wonder how we can combat it, because even, like I said, I don't think without the media, Corbyn would definitely become Prime Minister. So that's a real issue I think we're facing.
Absolutely. I think you put that very eloquently. The only thing I would add is you mentioned, specific journalists who earn fat wages for basically acting as PR agents. And that's what most journalists do today, is they're glorified PR agents. Some of them write quite well, lots of them don't. You actually get the impression today that sports journalists put in more effort than political journalists, and are more complex and nuanced in their analysis of sport than political journalists are of politics. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the fat wages are why they have become what they have become. They have become part of the establishment. And unfortunately, they now behave like the establishment, and they reinforce the establishment's views of itself. And, we're not surprised that the Daily Telegraph is unabashedly right-wing. We're not surprised that the Daily Mail is appallingly racist and awful. We are surprised that The Guardian has basically become more of a lifestyle magazine than a daily newspaper. There are actually, when I get my email from The Guardian, which I'm doing less and less, I used to get a whole lot of long features that I actually wanted to read. Now I get 2 a week, if I'm lucky, but I get about 8 to 12 things that are about lavish holidays that I can't afford, or restaurants that I can't afford to eat in. And I'll tell you something else. The Guardian, because its decline has been the most palpable evidence of the collapse of the British media, in my opinion. The Guardian and the BBC, where the BBC has become a propaganda arm of the state, largely. And I've done a lot of work with both over the past 20 years on corruption in the arms trade and various other issues that I think are quite important. So the Labour MP who publicly called Jeremy Corbyn an effing racist and an anti-Semite, publicly, benefited materially, lavishly, from the fact that her family company, whose board she served on at the time, and whose brother was the CEO of the family company at the time, acted as an agent for many, many years for the apartheid state in South Africa. During the 1980s, one of their most successful ongoing deals was to act as agents for the apartheid state's iron and steel company, the state-owned company called ISCO, selling that iron and steel to Pinochet's Chile. Now, this is also a person who claimed that the best day of her political life was the day that Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, because she had played such an important role in the global anti-apartheid struggle. In fact, her family company was on the lists of companies that the international anti-apartheid movement called on the world to boycott. Now, for me, this is a story that might interest some readers of what claims to be a centre-left newspaper in the country of this MP. This story was presented to The Guardian, literally with a bow on top of it. All of the documentation, every single part of this story had been archived, researched in the archives, and had been shown to be correct. The Guardian sat on the story for over 3 months so that it couldn't be published anywhere else. And at the end of those 3 months, decided they wouldn't be taking the matter any further. The Independent then decided not to publish the story. The story was originally published in the South African media and then made its way into the alternative media in the UK. That is the state of even the centre-left media, small as it is, in this country. And that is why this country is in so much trouble. You know, in South Africa, where corruption is a major challenge, even if the numbers don't quite add up to the corruption numbers in this country in relation to COVID-19, in relation to the bribes that our arms companies pay all over the world. But it is a major challenge of the democratic South Africa. Investigative journalists are revealing stories on a daily basis in South Africa through incredible work. And they're good stories. They're not sort of half-baked investigative stories. And the problem there is a different one, that the society as a whole, especially for 30 to 40% of the population who struggle to make ends meet every day, to have food in their mouths and a decent roof over their head. The problem is that they're just numb to all of these stories because there are so many of them. I would far rather be in that situation than the situation that we are in, where the stories are barely even making it into our media. And a lot of the stories are not. So I think the greatest responsibility we have is whatever we believe is the greatest challenge facing us, be it climate, conflict, inequality, racism. We have to get real, verified information into the public domain to counter the fact the media is no longer doing its job, to counter the era of what is being called fake news. And you know, on fake news, it's not new that politicians lie. With the first politicians came the first lies. What is new over the past 6, 7 or so years is that there seem to be no consequences for political lying. I came to this country 20 years ago. There were still consequences for politicians who lied then. I have watched Theresa May intentionally mislead Parliament. I have watched Boris Johnson mislead Parliament on an almost weekly basis, and there are absolutely no consequences. I have seen ministers violate their guidelines, the ministerial guidelines. I have seen them lie to the British public in almost as bald-faced a way as Tony Blair did about Iraq. And there are no consequences. And the only way we counter that is to put real information into the public domain and make it easy for people to access. And with technology, we can do that more easily. But the key is the veracity of the information. And that's what we as progressives have to do, because what those in power, and political and economic power is now the same thing. So those who run corporations and those who run our governments, what they don't want is for us, the ordinary people, the little people, to actually know what they are doing. And that's why I spend my life working on the global arms trade, because we see behavior that until recently, you wouldn't see from other company executives, you wouldn't see from politicians. And they would do it in the arms trade, which accounts for 40% of all corruption in global trade, because everything that happens in that trade is covered by national security secrecy. And there are these massive, complicated arms deals worth tens of billions of pounds that no one understands, in which they can completely manipulate the figures and in which huge, huge bribes are paid to the politicians who make the decisions, to their political parties, to the corporate executives who oversee the bribes, and of course, to those who sell their often useless products. So it has provided me with a window on the reality of our politics, even before Donald Trump and Theresa May and Boris Johnson. And it's in that way that I find doing this investigative work on the arms trade so interesting. And I would really encourage people like yourself. I think it's great that you're putting this channel together now, because I think anybody who feels passionately, who feels strongly about these issues, should try and find ways wherever possible to communicate about these issues and to put information into the public domain about them.
That was quite an inspiring monologue, actually. And you are right. There was in the media as an issue, and we are trying to do our best to combat the mainstream media. Andrew, it's been an unbelievable pleasure to have you on. You've expanded my mind so much. And this certainly won't be the last time we'll speak, because we could be talking for hours, because there's so many issues out there. But Andrew, it was a pleasure and an honour to have you on my show. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Anyone watching as well, actually, if you want to plug your film and let people know who are watching.
Well, what I would suggest, if people are interested in some of these issues, please have a look at the work I do in my very tiny not-for-profit organization called Shadow World Investigations. You can find it at shadowworldinvestigations.org. On there, you will see the various books that we have put out about various aspects of the British and global arms trade, the linkages between climate and conflict, which are profound and important to understand. The film is also called Shadow World. If you would like to organize a screening of the film, we do that all over the world on a regular basis, online, or hopefully in a few months' time, in person again, as we used to do before lockdown. But can I just say one other thing, not related to our work? A wonderful young woman in America called Margaret Mead, at the age of 15, was told by her father that she needed to leave school, help her mother more in the kitchen, and find a husband. Her response to that was to become the first woman to be awarded a PhD from Harvard. She went on to have an extraordinary career as an anthropologist, where she pointed out that people in places like the Amazon and others who we regarded as uncivilized were in many ways more civilized than we were. Towards the end of her life, she said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has."
Thank you so much, Andrew.